Well, good morning. Today we're in Galatians chapter 2, beginning in verse number 2. And I entitled this uh, little talk today, The Conclusion of the Matter. And yet, there are some, even today, holding on to this. Now, notice what Paul is saying in Galatians chapter 2 and 2. Now, when he says, I went up, he's referring to the story that is told in Acts, the 15th chapter. Things are coming to a peak. There's been contention in the church about this Gentile Jew situation, even to the fundamental business of being saved. What they were saying over there was that some had to be circumcised to be saved, that is, to keep the law. And the folks that were saying that were the Pharisees who believed, and yet they were still clinging to the law of Moses. Now, you do remember, don't you, in Galatians 1, this was how Paul begins to hammer this whole business out. Because you see, if you add to the gospel, you actually not only change it, but you change the very essential nature of it. That's why Paul talks about that even if an angel from heaven preaches another gospel unto you, let him be accursed. That ought to have been rather stunning to the folks, okay? So now look here what happens in Galatians 2 and 2. So I went up by revelation, that is, that God told them to go to Jerusalem. And they got to settle this matter once and for all. And we communicated unto them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles. Okay, just in case you don't know who those Gentile folks were, the Gentiles were outside the commonwealth of Israel. Let's just say simply, they're not Jews. The world's kind of divided between the Jew and the Gentile. And so this whole business of the Gentiles coming into the church caused a whole lot of problems for some folks. Really shouldn't have, but it did. Now, notice, we went up and of course, at the core of this whole business is the gospel that's preached to the Gentiles. What's required of them? What must they do to be saved? And so here's what he says. We went up privately to them which were of reputation, referring to some of the other apostles and elders in the church. And so he says, lest by any means I should have run in vain. Now, in other words, Paul was saying, I'm preaching a gospel that does not require you to keep the law. And if it does, I've run it, this whole ministry has been in vain, useless. Now watch what he says. In verse number 3, and this is an interesting verse here, he takes up with him Titus. Now Titus is a Gentile, he's not been circumcised, and yet he's been saved. Now that's going to be a contention with those Judaizers, but watch what happens here. I took neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek or a Gentile, was compelled, that is, forced by them. Here's the deal. All of those folks up there in the church at Jerusalem, with the other apostles, with the preeminent men in the kingdom of God. Here's Titus. He's not been circumcised, and yet they'll walk away from that whole business, and they'll conclude that Titus is saved and he didn't need to be circumcised. What's all that about? Well, it just simply means this. The Gentiles did not have to keep the law to be saved. And that's what folks were saying. Now, it's so important, isn't it, to understand that. Let me just say it again. When you start putting some stuff in there that doesn't belong, you're not just changing the character of it, you are actually changing the very fundamental, essential foundation of it. And so this is what's happening here. Now, notice this. Go over to Acts 15, and I'm gonna make it real quick here. But in Acts 15, notice this. Paul, what he does is in verse number 12, and this is, by the way, after Peter spoken and talked about, his business going into the Cornelius household, and how, again, Cornelius didn't have to be circumcised or keep the law, and he'll make the basic idea of it is that you're saved by grace through faith because of the cross. Now watch here. So when you get down, and this is something else we need to think about, and then I'll let you go real quickly here. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here, and we just don't have the time to dig deeper than we ought to. But anyhow, uh, then when after Peter gets up and speaks, then the multitude kept silent. And here's Paul and Barnabas get up to speak, and what they do is declare the miracles that God had worked among them. Now you couldn't do that unless God was with you. Even Nicodemus understood that about Jesus. No man could do these works except by God. So Nicodemus had some understanding that Jesus couldn't do what he did unless God was with him. And the evidence of that was the miracles. Now, Paul will make that same argument in chapter 3 when he says to these Gentile churches, he said, look, were you able to work those miracles under the law? And the answer, of course, no, they couldn't, and they didn't. And it was when Paul preached the gospel and bestowed miracles upon those folks, then they understood that what he was preaching was from God. That's the conclusion of the matter, really, isn't it? You don't have to keep the law. And yet there's still some today who tell you have to keep the Sabbath, you got to keep the law in order to be saved. How foolish and how wrong. Well, that's some deep thinking, isn't it? See you tomorrow. No, we're Friday. I'll see you next week. How about that?